welcome to Atlanta Rotary, everyone. Hope you all are off to a great start to the week on this week of St. Patrick's Day. Bob Hope will be leading us in the Invocation, and Bob is fresh off the trail from Honduras. You've heard a lot about his trip. He's going to share a few words about the trip as he's just returned Saturday night, I believe, and will then lead us in the Invocation and Pledge of Allegiance. And then David Duke will lead us in our patriotic hymn. So we'll be back with you shortly.
First, I would love for all of you to experience the joy that we experienced last week in Honduras. We go to a very rural area, have been going there for 23 years, and have just been able to see the good that it does. I mean, the fact that we built a really great school, and the kids that go through that school go on to college, and these are kids that live in little remote villages. And this was a particularly nice week. We had 27 people go on the trip. That's about half what we would have before COVID, but we were the first group to go into the Agalta Valley, Agalta Mountains in 2 years. And so they were so thrilled to have us. They were giving us gifts. They had all sorts of balloons and banners up for us. And it just was heartwarming to see how much progress they had made during COVID, trying to fix up their schools and improve things on their own. And then and just to see a group of people that go in there and work together. I always think it's amazing that you'll have, even in 27, you'll have probably 12 of them who really didn't know anybody else in the group till they got down there. And then by the end of the week, they're almost like a family. They're just, the people are very, very much really good friends. So anybody who wants to know anything else about Honduras, just let me know. Next year's trip is May 4th through the 11th. Vince Dooley broke his hip, couldn't go this year, but he's already sent me a note and said, look, I'm committed to next year on his 90th birthday to go down for a week, because he said he couldn't leave this earth without going there one more time. So just mark it down if you'd like to go. If you will, bow your heads. And Lord, in this beautiful and turbulent world that you've given to us so graciously, we're mystified sometimes to figure out what's going on. We've been through a plague, we have divisiveness, now we have a war, and we just really can't quite understand it. We try to make it all make sense. I'm reminded of a longtime member of this club, Bishop Bevel Jones, and something he told me years ago. We were leaving a very, very volatile meeting, and he just looked at me and he said, Bob, he said, God made some bad people. And I think all of us in this room try to look for the goodness in things. We look for the good in people when we see them, and sometimes we just have to accept there are some bad things out there, and we have to try to rationalize it. And we may come to the conclusion that this world exists based on the good versus the bad. Let us all be part of the good. Let us be part of the good and make sure that the good overwhelms the bad. We're thankful for the blessings you've given us. We realize that we are among the lucky people on earth that basically are fairly affluent, don't really have to struggle every day to live, and you've blessed us with that. Please bless this food, bless this group, and let us do what we can to contribute to the good in this world. Amen. I don't say right. I do a pledge of allegiance. Should I do that?
The pledge first.
Okay, pledge for all right.
Please don't pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I screwed that up.
This letter is 80 years old. It was written in a time of war. I am so blessed as to have every letter that went back and forth between my parents, between Atlanta and England, where he was flying bombing missions over occupied Europe. And these letters are full of inspiration, wisdom, anxiety, deep youthful longing. Both my parents knew shorthand, and when it gets into the really tender stuff, they started writing shorthand, so I can't decipher it. But I learned so much from them about life, and I know they would be very distressed at what's going on in the world today, and they would advocate prayer. And the saying that when you play music, it's like praying twice. And what I'm going to ask you all to do is pray with me in your hearts as I play one of my parents' favorite songs about America, and especially when it gets to the part about brotherhood. Because if we don't re-establish that in this country, we're not going to do well anywhere else.
Thank you, David and Bob, for those beautiful words. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll be right back with you. Welcome again to everyone. Welcome again to everyone, and good afternoon. Hope you are all adjusting to daylight savings time and off to a great start for the week. Our thoughts and prayers remain with those affected by the war in Ukraine. And you may remember my mentioning last week that there are actually 46 Rotary clubs in Ukraine. And there's been a lot of interest from fellow club members about what we can do and help and how to connect with our fellow Rotarians around the world. Just wanted everyone to know that we are working on some opportunities in collaboration with the Buckhead Club. And they have some ties through the Romanian and Moldovan club, Rotary clubs. So more on that soon, but we are working on some opportunities for support, assistance, and engagement, and we will keep everyone updated on that. Today we dig deeper into the war in Ukraine and have several very thought-provoking segments of our program. Following our announcements, we will have an opportunity for all of us to come together and reflect as fellow Rotarians as we share perspectives on the war through one of our Rotary Roundtable discussions. And then we're pleased to welcome back Larry Sampler. Larry is a former State Department, USAID, and United Nations official, and he will be speaking with us today about 21st century warfare. We begin our program by welcoming our guests. If each of you could please stand when I call your name so that we can recognize you. First, we have several guests of our speaker, which include Richard Bark, who is is a professor at Georgia Tech, as well as Kent Sampler, son of Larry Sampler, and Don Sampler, who is Larry's father and also a Rotarian at the Stone Mountain Club. So welcome to each of you. Also, a warm welcome to my guest, Walter Brown. Where's Walter? There he is. And Chris Brand guest of Henry Grady, who is also the District 6900 Assistant Governor. Chris, if you'll please stand. There he is. Welcome. And Jared Schmidt, also a guest of Henry Grady. Welcome. Also Billy Medoff, who's a guest of Billy Levine. Finally, a special warm welcome to guest of Sham Reddy, Natalia Weiner. Natalia is from the U.S., but her parents originally were from Ukraine, fled there during World War II. She has a wonderful and fascinating story of her own family's history in Ukraine, and we're so happy she could be here as a guest of Sham today. Welcome again to all of you. A few club announcements. Our Rotary roster is such a popular and helpful tool for all of us to stay in touch with one another. And I know Gina and her team have been working hard to make sure that the information in the roster is as accurate as possible. Just wanted to let you know that you will receive an email tomorrow with a reminder to please update your contact information. Please be on the lookout and click on that link if you have any updates to share. We really appreciate your cooperation with that. We heard from Bob. I also wanted to just thank him specifically for his amazing leadership with the Honduras trip. That is such an important program for our club. And also, I believe there were 5 additional Rotary clubs represented in that trip. And Bob, we so appreciate your leadership in this long-standing, very important service mission. We look forward to hearing more about that very soon. Our Old Timers Dinner was a huge success this week. You will see some pictures. I think you can tell from all the big smiles that you see there. It was such a great evening, wonderful time for fellowship and reconnections. I know many of you were there that evening. Just want to say a special thank you again to Tommy Hills for his leadership in putting together such a terrific evening, and also to Gina, Abby, and Nan for their great work. It was a wonderful time of fellowship and just a lot of fun for everyone. Our next Rotary on the Road is right around the corner. You've heard me talk about this, but this is coming up on April the 4th. We'll have an opportunity to visit Norfolk Southern's headquarters with an insider view of their their rail operations war room. We'll also hear special insights from CEO Jim Squires. And this will be the first public event that Norfolk Southern has held in their brand new headquarters. I know you won't want to miss that opportunity, so please be on the lookout. You'll receive an email this week as part of our regular updates, and you can start your registration process through that email coming right to you this week. Finally, just a quick save the date. Several very special speakers right around the corner. This includes Sally Yates on March 28th, our April supply chain series that Adrian Cronier has done a phenomenal job bringing together 4 notable CEOs as part of that series, including the CEO of the Georgia Ports Authority, and then, of course, Mayor Dickens, who will be joining us on May the 2nd. We have a phenomenal lineup ahead for this spring. Great speakers, great events. Again, I know you won't want to miss a single one of them. Finally, this weekend marked 2 very important milestones with our city's leadership. We celebrated the 90th birthday of former Mayor Andrew Young, and we also sadly learned of the passing of former Mayor Sam Massell, whom we lost yesterday morning. Mayor Massell was one of those amazing leaders who never stopped serving this city even long after he was mayor. He was absolutely devoted to this community, and he will be missed dearly. Please join me in a moment of silence as we remember this amazing hero of our community. Thank you so much. I'm now pleased to kick off another of our beloved Rotary Roundtable discussions among all of us. Last week, I know we were all moved by the very personal story from Mark Adler, who spoke of his Ukrainian wife, Veronica, and her family battling the war in Ukraine. Their lives have been completely shaken by that war. And I know that as we all watch the news and hear other stories of the tragedies and heroism of the war, we're all feeling the impact of this moment in history on our lives. So our discussion today centers on this same topic as we reflect together about all of that and about what's ahead in this next chapter of our history. In a moment, I will ring the bell, and we'll give us about 10 minutes for conversation. There's no report out, and I'll ring the bell when it's time to resume our program. So here's the question. How is the war in Ukraine impacting your business or you personally? And what do you see as the implications for your business in the next 3 to 5 years? So please have a table discussion about that, and we'll be back together very shortly. So sorry, as always, to have to bring these conversations to a close. Hopefully you will continue these beyond our program today. I'm now honored to introduce fellow Rotarian Sham Reddy, who will introduce our featured speaker today. Sham serves as Chief Administrative Officer, Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of Blue Links Holdings. Needless to say, he wears a lot of hats. And this Renaissance man theme seems to thread through all of Sham's impressive career. Sham has held executive leadership roles across several fascinating sectors, including Blue Links Building Products, the U.S. General Services Administration, and through his work as a former partner at Kilpatrick Stockton. He also has a multifaceted educational career that began here at home at Emory with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Master's in Public Health, and then he moved on to obtain his law degree from the University of Georgia. All of these experiences have come together to equip him well to serve as, most recently, as chair of the Carter Center Board of Counselors and as a board member of the the German Marshall Fund of the U.S. He is one of these exceptionally talented and multifaceted leaders who leads us so capably in an increasingly complex and multifaceted landscape. Sham, thank you so much for joining us today. Sham was instrumental in bringing us Larry. Last time he spoke with the club, and we decided to bring them both back for more and really look forward to our program today. So welcome, Sham.
Oh, Catherine, I wasn't expecting that, but I appreciate the kind words. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be back in person again, and just to be able to engage in important fellowship. So thanks for coming. So as some of you know, I'm a Marshall Memorial Fellow. I serve on the Board of Trustees for the U.S. German Marshall Fund, and I'm the former chairman of the Board of Counselors at the Carter Center, like Catherine said. Civil society, the transatlantic relationship, NATO, and the post-World War II rules-based order that enabled countries to respect borders and settle disagreements and disputes diplomatically rather than through war or violence are near and dear to me. With Russia blowing up the longest period of peace in the history of Europe, more than 70 years, by invading Ukraine illegally and without justification on February 24th, a day that none of us should ever forget, Putin reshuffled the geopolitical map in ways that were incomprehensible a few weeks ago. Just a few examples. Germany's pivot on defense, given its history, and that's something that I think you should let sink in. It is a big deal for them to have committed to allocate 2% of their budget in accordance with NATO standards towards defense and take on some of the other things they're going to do, just given their history in World War II. Europe's decision to wean itself off Russian energy, which seemed to be so obvious to all of us for years, and now it took a war for them to finally do that. The UK's moves to lead the way and seize Russian oligarchic assets, despite its close relationships with them. Hungary and Poland stepping up in spite of their recent domestic rollbacks of democratic principles and rights. Article 4 being exercised, and NATO deploying its rapid response force, which is a first for both. And then, of course, deployment of U.S. forces in numbers that have never been seen before to shore up Europe's eastern flanks. And those are just a few. So it's my privilege to introduce Larry Sampler, a former Green Beret and Georgia Tech alum, who's going to speak to us during one of the most challenging times we've faced since World War II. Having served as a senior government official in both Republican and Democratic administrations, Larry has lived and worked in half a dozen conflict zones overseas. He has been in the U.S. military, Departments of Defense and State, USAID, the United Nations Peacekeeping Missions, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and also for both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. Through his governance work in post-conflict zones, Larry has helped countries maintain peace through implementation of effective governance to peace models, which are clearly under threat right now. So we're very fortunate to have Larry share his observations about how the United States and our allies can pursue war and peace in the 21st century, and some of the challenges and opportunities we face as Americans, as global citizens, and as a country. So please give a hearty welcome.
Yeah, good. The first thing I have to do is thank you for having me back. The opportunity to speak in Atlanta is a great one for me. I'm from here, and it gives me the chance to have both my dad and my son here. So it doesn't happen often with as much as I've traveled around the world. I've been gone more than I've been here. And in addition, Dr. Richard Bark from Georgia Tech is one of the mentors who is probably just thrilled I graduated. So to think of me ever in front of a group like this is beyond the ken for most of my professors. I have to say, y'all are a tough crowd, because there are so many people from so many different backgrounds with so many different perspectives. And so one of the things I think we'll agree on are my 2-chair drill, and I'll do it very quickly so we can get to the meat of the program. 1 chair is to keep us grateful. There are men and women all over the world who are literally fighting and dying as we sit at lunch to guarantee the rights to freedom for people like us, so that we can assemble, so that we can speak our minds, so that we can worship as we choose, so that we can marry who we choose. And it reminds me that I now have the privilege of no longer being in the trenches, but of coming and doing things like this because, as I think it was Orwell said, brave men stand ready to visit violence on those who would do us harm. We have people who are standing between us and the bad guys, and we need to be grateful. The other chair, and it's not as necessary in a group like this, is to keep me humble. In a room with more than 2 people, I am never the smartest person in the room, but I try actually to do my best to present things that will be new and a little bit different. So one of my colleagues in the international community likes to describe the U.S. approach to foreign policy as 7-year-olds on the soccer pitch. They follow the ball, but they don't necessarily see the big picture. So what I hope to do today is throw a few things out that will distract you from the ball, which we all know is Ukraine, and focus a little bit more on what's behind the scenes and what goes on beyond that. Let's see if I can do this. All right. So my background is a jack of all trades and a master of none. There are at least 3 universities up on the screen, 2 think tanks, 3 government agencies. I have, by no great feat of my own, had the privilege of working in this field for almost 30 years and of seeing it from every perspective. I've been an officer in the UN at a very senior diplomatic level. I've worked in the Organization for the Security and Cooperation of Europe at a senior level. And what that means is not that I'm better than people that haven't, it just means I've seen the dysfunction of these organizations in ways that other people maybe haven't. This is a rough outline of what I want to be able to talk about today, and I'm going to be as quick as I can because I do want to be able to do questions and answers. I have a scene setter that I'm going to very briefly read because I think it does a good job of both simplifying and then also complicating our discussions today. About 9:30 p.m., this is from February, about 9:30 p.m. the alarm was given. We children knew that sound and got up and dressed quickly to hurry down into our cellar. Some minutes later, we heard a horrible noise, the bombs. There were nonstop explosions. Our cellar filled with fire and smoke and was damaged. The lights went out and wounded people shouted dreadfully. In great fear, we struggled to leave the cellar. My mother and my older sister carried the big basket in which the twins were laying. With one hand, I grasped my younger sister, and with the other, I grasped the coat of my mother. We fled into another cellar, overcrowded with injured and distraught men, women, and children, shouting, crying, and praying. No light except some electric torches. We saw terrible things. Cremated adults shrunk to the size of small children, pieces of arms and legs, dead people, whole families burnt to death. Burning people ran to and fro, burnt coaches filled with civilian refugees, dead rescuers, and dead soldiers. Many were calling and looking for their children and families, and fire was everywhere. All the time, the hot wind of the firestorm threw people back into the burning houses they were trying to escape from. I will never forget. The point of this is that war is born on the backs of the people who suffer the war. We in the United States don't see that with the same immediacy as Europe. The steppes of Europe have seen war since time immemorial. We happen to benefit from oceans on two fronts and friendly nations to our north and south. People who live on the eastern parts of Europe don't have that benefit. So it simplifies it because war is horrible. We all know that, but just reading that is difficult. It complicates our life because that's not a story from Ukraine. That's a story from the Dresden firebombing in 1945. And the bombing was done by U.S. and British aircraft. My point today is going to be, war has shifted enormously since 1945, but in some ways, and for some people, Putin being one of them, it hasn't shifted in the ways that it has for us. So our military budget is greater than the military budget of the next 11 countries combined. I won't read you the names of the countries, but if you take the next 11 countries, our military budget is bigger than all of theirs. If you look at our military budget compared to our State Department budget, it is about 16 times larger. Our military budget is about 16 times larger than our diplomacy budget. Now, one of the points I'm going to make today is there's not a war and peace dichotomy here. War and peace are kind of like the ingredients of a cake. You can't unmix them and sort them out. When we're at war, we're still trying to get to peace, and when we're at peace, we are unfortunately still planning for war. There's an old expression, if you have a hammer, every problem's a nail. When you have a $700 billion hammer, you really like problems that look like a nail. And you really hate it when the State Department says, yeah, this is maybe not the time for a hammer. You really want to be able to use that tool that you've built. And we do have one of the finest militaries in the world. So there's a guy named Ambrose Bierce, was a Civil War veteran. He wrote a book called Devil's Dictionary, a famous four-star general who I adore. The only man I actually know who had a bookshelf in his bathroom. This was in place of prominence in his restroom. So if you're interested in some light reading, but still kind of pointed and relevant, Ambrose Bierce, Devil's Dictionary is what it's called. But in a little more pointed note, and maybe a little more seriously, Karl von Clauswitz, one of the most often quoted, seldom read or understood authors on war, he famously said, war is the continuation of diplomacy by other means. And even more impactful, Frederick the Great, who was the King of Prussia, and if you don't know him, he's the guy that Napoleon looked up to as a really sharp general. He actually said diplomacy without military might is like music without instruments. So the integration of diplomacy, of peace and war is inseparable. We can't have peace on one extreme and war on the other. They're mixed together. I'll add to that, a diplomat from this part of the world, he was actually from Belarus, said that diplomacy is what you say to a mean dog when you're looking for a big stick. I think that fits a lot with what's been going on in Ukraine right now. See, I've got a few geeky slides, and this is the first of about 4 of them. You don't need to worry about the small words on this slide, and let me just go ahead and build it. The way the United States breaks things down is by operational plans, and there are 6 phases to a U.S. military operation. Shape is when you're trying to prevent the conflict, you're trying to get people to do the right thing for the right reasons. Doesn't involve any kind of warfare, doesn't involve anything kinetic. It's psychological operations, it's media operations, it's marketing. Deter is where you get a little more pointed. They begin to do things you don't want them to do, and you're trying to discourage those specific things. This is still not kinetic. It's heating up a little bit, so I changed the color to orange. You're a little more pointed in your messaging. Seize the initiative, dominate, and stabilize are the phases of the war. And again, there's a lot more that I won't go into in the interest of time, but those are the 3 that we think of as war. And what I want you to do is stretch your brain. And again, there's no war and peace, but there's this mix in the middle. That's when the fighting is going on. And as quickly as possible, we want to get to stabilize and then enable the civilian government to do their thing, and then we're back to shape. So in a way, this is almost a spherical situation. We're always trying to do shape, always throughout. And you can see from the way the chart builds, shape never goes away. It's always there underneath the kinetic operations. So in a time of war, peace, whenever you want, there's a guy named Abraham Maslow who in the 1950s or actually 1940s came out with a book called A Theory of Human Motivation. And he was actually just a psychologist, and they use this in schools all the time. But I use it pretty aggressively when we do post-conflict reconstruction, because this is the priority order of things we have to focus on. And again, I'm just going to build the slide really quickly and let you read it. If you go into Ukraine in months, weeks, whenever we can go back in, you'll start at the bottom of this pyramid and work your way up if you want to have any real sense of success, any real hope of rebuilding that society. Now, it's not perfectly linear, and there's lots of sidetracks and recycles, and you go back but if you don't have somebody providing physiological needs and basic safety and security, you can't do the other things that you want to do. So what I've done here is I've overlaid the Maslowian hierarchy on the left with kind of a chart showing how the U.S. government and the international community intervene in these post-conflict settings to stop the war and to do the things that allow us to meet those Maslowian needs. Over the top, you'll see a security presence. And you can think maybe about Afghanistan, think about the Balkan wars. The Ukraine war is not there yet. But security presence is what makes the other things possible. And as time goes on, you start out with humanitarian assistance. That's putting people in tents. That's getting them out of the snow and out of the slush and keeping them warm and giving them food. Then you begin with recovery. That's letting them go back to their house and giving them UNHCR plastic so they can cover the windows and begin to rebuild their home. And then developing reconstruction is when you give the farmers seed and you build a farmer's market so the people back in their homes can now go buy local produce instead of having it shipped in from abroad. All of that done under an umbrella of security. But in reality, what we wind up doing is we very quickly want to draw down the security, because that $700 billion hammer is not made for doing this kind of work. It's made to be going out and breaking things, and this is actually the peacekeeping part. And they don't like it, and they're not good at it, and they're very, very expensive. So you see the security presence drops off very rapidly. And when that happens, what we also lose is the ability to move in those spaces. The Balkan War was a great example of that. When the international military drew down in the Balkans, we very quickly lost our ability to go out and marry these communities back up and do all of that recovery and development and reconstruction work that we wanted to do. So this is the next point. Unity is essential and elusive. There's a parable from the places I've worked, Central Asia actually, of 6 blind wise men describing an elephant. Each of them grabs a different piece of the elephant, and each one of them describes it accurately and truthfully, but they're all wrong. But they're all right at the same time. Their answer is only useful when you can bring the 6 together and have a conversation where everybody's perspectives are heard and integrated together. And that's a challenge whether you're talking about the U.S. government, you're talking about the international community, the U.S. military. What we try for is unity of effect. And this is a military slide, it builds pretty quickly. Unity of effect requires unity of action. Unity of action requires unity of effort. Unity of effort requires a unity of vision, and that requires unity of command. And we don't have that. Very quickly from Afghanistan, if you were a young captain in the Army working in the fields in Afghanistan and you were working with a young State Department officer, maybe in their 20s and 30s, and you're working together on this unity of action that we're trying to get to, I won't ask you to guess, I'll just tell you, your chains of command for that young State Department officer and that young military officer don't ever meet until you get to the president. At no point in their chain of command do you have a unified command that says this is what we're doing in Afghanistan. If you're in the State Department, it goes all the way up through the ambassador and then to the Secretary of State, and if you're in the military, it goes up to the Joint Forces Commander, and then from there to the SecDef and to the President as well. So we lack that unity of command. Now, this is a slide, if you'll look at it for a minute, count the black dots for me on this slide and tell me how many you think you see. One of the challenges here is, and those of you who were around for Vietnam know that body counts were the thing in Vietnam. And it's because it's pretty easy to count bodies. Now, we learned the hard way it's also easy to lie about it, but you tend to do the things that get counted, and a lot of times the things that get counted are just not really the things that we need to focus on, particularly in a place like Ukraine right now, where it's so much about hearts and minds and passion and loyalty and devotion. Those are not easy things to count. Anybody here who's in marketing knows how much you value having metrics and outputs of your marketing campaigns. But in this kind of work, those are hard to come by. This is the other problem. Some of the people who go into these theaters see a young maiden, and some people see an old crone. And both are okay. You don't have to convince anybody to see the other. Truly savants in the field are people who can hold both of those competing images at near the same time and understand what the other person sees. I could say that's the military and the State Department, and it would be absolutely true. We go into these problems and we think we see the problem, and we're accurate, we're not lying, we're not wrong, but we don't see the problem the way the $700 million hammer sees the problem. And by the way, Congress doesn't really like it when you can't see the problem the same way. They don't like hearing those kinds of debates. So, third problem, who are we? Pronouns are important. Working in Afghanistan for as long as I did, there were 72 countries represented in Afghanistan. There were 48 militaries represented there. So when somebody would say the international community will not stand for this, I'll say, who do you mail a postcard to at the international community? Because I'd really like to talk to them about that. There is no we to the international community. It's like the business class lounge at Heathrow Airport. A lot of people, same room, same time, same purpose, getting on a plane, but you would never walk into a business class lounge at Heathrow Airport and say, my people, it's good to have you all in a room together. So we can't assume a community where one doesn't exist. The little reference sheet I left on the table, one that I should have put on there, Sam Nunn had an assistant or an employee named Jim Locker who wrote an excellent book called Victory on the Potomac. And it's about how we went from being multiple militaries, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, to a joint military. And it was one of the most important things that happened in the last century. Truly, truly pivotal. The Victory on the Potomac is how Congress did that. They forced it on our military to go from them to us. We need that now for the civilian side of government as well, to bring the military and the civilians together so that we do have that unity of command. Now, this is a slide that builds, it's a little bit snarky, but it's one that I've used in the military and at War College, talking to military officers and civilian State Department as well. Those are not quotes that I made up. Those are actual quotes about how the military see the civilians and how the civilians see the military. And now these are some of the reasons that they see things differently. Civilians go into these places to stay. The military goes in to get their job done and leave. In Afghanistan, when I showed up in 2002, I was astounded to learn that there were NGOs, even American NGOs, who had been there for literally decades. So the civilians have the longevity, they understand the nuances of the loyalties and the different local topographies. If you think all politics is local, all warfare is even more local when you go into places like Ukraine and like Afghanistan. So this slide is building on its own. I've talked about a lot of contextual challenges and problems that we have. As you watch the slide build, this is kind of how it comes out. When we go to Afghanistan, we ask for X. And depending on who we ask of, and if you imagine the memos, there are dozens of people that are copied and infoed, and everybody gets to see the memo. Everybody defines what we've asked for differently. And again, none of them are necessarily wrong, but they're not all necessarily helpful. And this should be the summary slide. There we go. So War and Peace is a long book for a reason. This is really complicated stuff. Don't think of War and Peace as kind of the yin and yang symbol. Think of it as a cake that you started mixing and you can't unbake it. The ingredients of war are always present during peace, and the opportunities for peace are always present during war. And the word that I would layer over both of those is diplomacy. I think war is a measure of diplomacy by other means. Peace after war is especially hard, and when I turn the page, we're going to start on the Ukraine part of this conversation. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a pretty good measure of what we need in a post-conflict setting, and then getting the right people in the room and getting them to agree on what we're going to do is really, really challenging. We're just not good at that. And finally, the pronoun parts are important. Now, I've raced through this. I hope I have done justice to giving you just enough to maybe pique your interest or annoy you a little bit. Not too much. I would like to work in this town at some point in the future. But so I'm really a stickler, Dr. Bark. I don't like it when people argue with me when they don't know what they're talking about. When I was at Georgia Tech, I wrote a paper, and I tried to make the thesis was that people's vehemence on their opinion about Vietnam was inversely proportional to their knowledge about the country. And it was actually pretty easy to prove. These are some things that no one should really be able to disagree about with respect to Ukraine. A little editorial note, the Ukraine refers to the area when it was part of the Soviet Union and the Commonwealth of Independent States. It was referred to as a region, kind of like the South. Ukraine is what the country is actually called as a matter of respect. And I'm not going to read this slide to you. It's huge. It's the size of Texas. The population is around 43 million people. If you look further down, that is not a typo. The average salary is around $550 a month. The Humanitarian Development Index is kind of the good housekeeping seal of approval for how countries are at taking care of their population. They're not doing great. They're 74th out of about 180 countries. On the corruption perception test, scale of 100, they scored 32. That's not good. They're about 122nd out of 180 countries among businessmen who are trying to do business there. So, when people talk about Ukraine, it is not a country without problems. It has challenges. There's no question about that. But their new administration was supposed to be, and has every appearance of being, a breath of fresh air. Our country took a while to get our act together. We had our Articles of Confederation some 12 to 15 years after our initial Declaration of Independence. Ukraine is a country with tremendous potential. Some of you may have seen things on Facebook or on the internet about how much potential they have in terms of what they've got to mineral wealth, and they are the breadbasket of Europe in many ways. Now, what I didn't put on here was one of the questions that somebody sent me in an email setting this up. What impact does, for example, the Budapest Memorandum have on this? The two largest nuclear arsenals in the world have been the U.S. and the U.S. and USSR, Soviet Union. The third largest was Ukraine. They had an enormous number of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They didn't have the control codes for them, but they had the weapons. They had the material, the fissile material. The goal was, when the Soviet Union fell apart, for Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, who had all this material, nuclear weapon material, we want to get that back. We don't really want to see that floating around the world, so we'd like to get that back in safe hands. And so the Budapest Memorandum were actually 3 memoranda, one with each of those countries, making some security assurances and some financial contributions to the states, if in turn they would surrender their nuclear fissile material to the Soviet, or to the Russians in some cases, for turning it into fuel rods, and in some cases we went in and got it back, and we brought it back for them. The Budapest Memorandum isn't directly relevant. I should also say diplomacy is, as you saw in the Ambrose Bierce, diplomacy is the tactical art of patriotically lying for your country. The Budapest Memorandum is a memorandum, it's not a treaty. U.S. Congress never ratified it. So the legal standing of the document is in question. There is no question that the principle has been violated. Ukraine was promised that as long as they stayed neutral, they didn't join the CIS, that they left in 2018. But if the nation of Ukraine would stay independent, not in NATO, not in CIS, then they would be guaranteed security from both sides. Putin violated that when he invaded and annexed the Crimean Peninsula. And to the bottom, if you don't know this stuff, this Azov Sea right here is really one big port for the Russian military, the Russian Navy. And people refer to the Black Sea as a Russian lake. If Russia had their way, they would own and operate the Black Sea, taking a page from China's handbook with respect to the South China Sea. They consider that still their near abroad. That's a term from the old Cold War days. And they couldn't have the Crimean Peninsula in the hands of NATO because it so controls this little tiny strait right there. I can't even make my hand steady enough to show it well. So that mattered a lot to them. They invaded, they annexed Crimea, and now they'd like to do the same and build themselves a buffer between the rest of Europe and Russia here. I'll stop. If there are no questions, I'll give you back about 5 or 10 minutes, but if there are questions, I'm more than happy to enter a discussion. I really thank you for your patience. I once again tried to cover 2 hours worth of material in about 15 minutes, but thank you for coming. Do you have any time?
Yeah, we have time for.
Okay. Go ahead.
We have time for several questions, so please jump in.
And if you shout it out, I'll repeat the question if you like. Just so we don't have to do microphones. Yes, sir.
What is a potential exit route for Putin at this point?
Yeah. So the question was, what is Putin's exit route? I don't think he has one. To be honest. There are smarter people than me who've done a lot of assessments of him, and the intelligence community is one of them. And they all differ, but kind of the consensus of where they are is he's almost certainly using steroids to maintain his fitness. The Soviet Union and then Russia afterwards have been famous for doping their athletes to get more out of them. He's famous for being a martial artist, right up there with Steven Seagal when it comes to seriousness and capabilities, which was a joke. But the intelligence community is pretty certain that he is using steroids, and those have consequences for your mental abilities and for your ability to control anger and rage. And they're concerned now that he is, and they also can diminish your ability to resist infection. So when you see the table settings where he's sitting at one end of a long table and everybody else is at the other end, a benign version of that is he wants to protect himself from COVID. But a more serious version might be that he is immunocompromised to some degree, and he wants to make certain that nothing happens to him, so he keeps people at that much of a distance. There isn't anyone that I've talked to, and this is, again, no longer my circus, not my monkeys, but I do stay in touch with my colleagues who work in these areas. Most of them think he only sees one way out, and that's straight ahead. That's why some of the oligarchs are beginning to make known their frustrations with that approach. And I'm sure there's all kinds of behind-the-scenes skullduggery of different levels of kind of malignancy with respect to how Russia can get out of this, whether Putin gets out of it or not. But it's very much focused on Vladimir Putin and what he wants to do. He has isolated his cell of senior advisors in a way that's very narcissistic and very unproductive and very unhelpful, because anyone who would speak truth to power is not accepted at all. So there isn't one. I think that the two ways this will end is the Ukrainians will bleed them dry the way the Afghans did some 30 years ago, and he will just have to leave because he can no longer sustain it. There was a news story yesterday. He had apparently requested military assistance from China, which China now denies, but he has not shown the Russian military to be the mighty military that he thought it was. And that was one of the biggest fallouts for us from Afghanistan. The myth of American military supremacy, despite our $700 billion hammer, was a bunch of Afghans kicked us out of the country after 20 years. We've now seen the same thing. The Russian military, which people were so terrified of in Eastern Europe, it ain't all that. And one of the ways that war has changed is there are now technologies available that make asymmetric warfare much, much easier. So if you're a Ukrainian housewife, and literally there are Ukrainian housewives who've been trained on how to use Javelin missiles, and we've provided the missiles, and there are Ukrainian housewives who can take out a Russian tank. You don't have to run with a Molotov cocktail anymore up and drop it in the turret. You can stand back and use those missiles. So I think he's just going to wind up getting his nose repeatedly bloodied until these talks can produce some sort of fig leaf that will allow him to say, okay, we've gotten what we wanted. It may be a recognition of the annexation of Crimea. The Ukraine government has not recognized that. He will probably want Donbass, and part of that, again, that far eastern slopes of Ukraine, and I don't see the government of Ukraine giving him that either. But that's a great question. I don't know the answer. Yes, sir? The question was, what's the view of internal Russian opposition? I don't have an educated one. Again, I'm the 6-year-old with a soccer ball here. But during the Soviet days, we spent a lot of time focusing on who showed up at parades and who stood where on the parapet. It was called criminology, and you studied kind of who's in a position of favor and who's in a position of power. A lot of like what we do now with the DPRK, with North Korea. We study every picture to see who's where. Putin has so isolated himself that it's Putin and his immediate circle of cronies who he chooses to listen to, and that's it. So I think the opposition are operating, and they are growing, and they are able to speak in the vacuum as long as nobody hears their voices. I think when the opportunity comes, we will find the opposition is there and ready. But unfortunately, yet, unless somebody's seen something I haven't, there is no credible source that tells me there's a serious alternative to just following President Putin right now. And that's horrible. Yes, ma'am. On the very back. Thank you.
One of the things that's really different about this, from my observation of history, is the role of the corporation. You've talked a lot about the State Department and the military. And from my chair, watching international companies who have operations in Ukraine or Poland or Hungary or Russia, and their behavior is just extraordinary, both in the rescue effort, the maintenance of Ukrainian people effort, and they're real actors, and they're acting very quietly and not issuing press releases. But I'd love for you to comment on that.
Well, that's a great point. And actually, again, I've given it a little more time, another hour or two. One of the things I talk about is the evolution of warfare from then to now. And there are more international corporations now than there are single nation corporations. Another book, I can't remember the author's name, but the title of the book is called Ghost Fleet. And it's a novel written by two military strategists, really, really good novel, well-grounded in the realities of the past decade. And they make the point, in that particular book, that China attacks the U.S. in a number of ways, and it's the corporations that save us. The U.S. military has the same kind of logistical problems that the Russian military is having in Ukraine, and I can't remember if it's Google or Amazon, but anyway, responsible corporate actors who are willing to be corporate citizens, national, global citizens, Responsible corporate actors who are willing to be global citizens first are, I think, in many ways going to be the wave of the future and maybe the salvation of getting out of situations like what we're facing in Ukraine right now. Great question. Yes, ma'am.
So for someone who suffers from a malignant personality disorder the way Putin seems to, and now you're mentioning steroids, the other option that he may be seeing to put an end to all of this is the threat of nuclear weapons. How serious is that? I know he's set them to the highest alert possible, and I know Zelensky said he's a murderer, not suicidal, but I don't find great comfort in whether or not he's being rational, and could he, in fact, do something nuclear?
And that's a great question, and I'm not qualified to answer, but of course I will. I think all of us who work in this field worry about nuclear escalation. The question around the various treaties and non-proliferation treaties that we've signed to get nuclear weapons into the hands of responsible adults, we didn't see this coming when we did that. You may know that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the one thing that saved us from a nuclear conflict then was a particular Politburo officer on a particular submarine who they had gotten a message to launch their weapons, and he said, that can't be right, we're not doing that. Had he acquiesced, as he was expected to, they would have launched nuclear weapons during the Cold War. So we can't say that nuclear engagement is not possible and not likely. Putin is very much a kleptocrat, and the oligarchs around him, the people advising him, are incredibly wealthy. I mean, more wealthy than any of us in this room can imagine, even though I'm sure there are some here who are well off. The amount of money that they have rapaciously taken from the state just boggles the mind. But there's no value in having a $100 million yacht or a $500 million yacht if the ocean is boiling around you and you don't have a place to sail it. So I think there are enough realists who understand the consequences of nuclear conflict to keep that from happening. Now, what you didn't ask is biological and chemical weapons, which are kind of a half step down. They are still classified as weapons of mass destruction. There are still treaties in place about how that'll be handled if they're used. You know, a lot of us thought we were right on the cusp of that when they isolated and damaged Chernobyl and took the power out at the Chernobyl nuclear plant, and then the next largest nuclear power plant down the river, they did the same thing. A nuclear disaster at one of those plants in Ukraine would have consequences for all of Europe. The question was, do we consider that a nuclear incident? I think we're all doing everything we can to keep from going that route. And that's an important question too, and I'll make this point. You know, President Biden has not been as aggressive as I would have liked, to be honest, in terms of U.S. support to Ukraine. He gets a much better reading folder than I do, and his team does not play six-year-old on the soccer field. They're looking at the whole thing. But first and foremost in their mind is making sure this does not become a confrontation between the United States and Russia, because that very quickly could go nuclear. In fact, there aren't many ways for it not. They can't invade us. We can't invade them. So if we start trading body blows with the other nuclear superpower on the planet, that doesn't end well for anyone. So we're looking for ways that we can use surrogates, whether it's the Poles, the Hungarians, others in the area. We're looking for ways that we can find track 2 diplomacy to talk to people around Putin. Even though I said there aren't many, we're looking for them and trying to find ways to offer him ways out. But nobody wants it to get to the point. I think it's right to be worried about it. It's one of those things that there's nothing we can do about. And I mean, short of, as Dr. Bark was saying, buying canned goods and hiding under our desks, we don't have a dog in that fight, so to speak. We just have to suffer the consequences if it goes there. And right now, I think everyone is working to make sure it doesn't go there.
What's the resolution in this kind of disconnect between State Department and our military command? Is there a way to...
Oh boy! So the question was, how do we get from the various we's to a true joint us? So Jim Locker's the Project on National Security Reform. So if you look up PNSR, Project on National Security Reform, when Jim Locker retired from working for Sam Nunn, he saw that what he had done for the military, that created the Joint Chiefs of Staff and created one U.S. military, we needed to do that for the U.S. government. When we go to Ukraine or when we go to Afghanistan, we can't have these separate chains of command, and he saw that. And he had something called the Project for National Security Reform. Colin Powell was kind of the co-author for helping to stand that up, and it died. And it died in Washington. I was actually the deputy coordinator for something called the Secretary's Civilian Response Corps. It was supposed to be State Department officials who had a military background like mine, who were comfortable going out without all the protections, and we were able to work with our military so we could begin to integrate our military mailed fist, the 700 billion hammer, with the ability to do things that didn't require a hammer. It died because there were forces at State Department and in the Defense Department who didn't want to see that done. And it's just, and Jim Walker in that book, Victory on the Potomac, it's a thick book because he talks about how fiercely the services fought against being drawn into a joint military. Every one of the services fought it. Nobody wanted it. Now, 40 years later, everybody's really glad we have it. So we haven't had yet the political gravitas. Our Congress is somewhat divided. We haven't had the political gravitas to center around this and say we really need to get to this point. It's still there. Jim Walker hasn't died yet. PNSR is kind of on the shelf waiting for someone to have the political will to dust it off and pull it out. But thank you very much, and that's a great question to end on. I really appreciate the chance to come talk to you, and I hope it's been of some value to you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Joel. Thank you so much. That was incredible. And thank you especially for your service to our country. We remember your prior program on Afghanistan, and I think we all left feeling that it was a bit of lightning in a bottle. And it is just the same today. I can tell we could go on for multiple hours with all of the incredible knowledge packed in your brain. So thank you for making us all a much better informed group today. Next week, I will be traveling out of the country. I'm very grateful that President-elect Stephanie will be covering for me. We have another fascinating program with Andrew Filer and Doug Hooker talking about the history of the 5,000 Rosenwald schools that were built for African-American children around the South in the 1900s. So I know you won't want to miss that program as well. Hope you all have a wonderful week. Thank you so much.